That I would go first to introduce the question as we see it. And we're both very glad to be here, particularly because I did work here, which I loved, but also because you've invited high school students, college students, law school students, and we both talk to those groups of students a lot, and we want to do that. And the reason we do, in special part, is because there's a lot of skepticism and then cynicism about government in the United States. And I'll say to the students, I understand that, and probably some of that is justified, but if there's too much of it, well, the government just won't work, because you're part of the government, and if you're not going to be part, we don't have a government. That's what I want to tell them. All right, now how can I tell them that? How can I do my bit on this? I'm a judge. You know, I don't run for office. It's hard to get people's attention on a general question like that. But my bit consists of trying to explain my institution. What is it I do? What is it that Justice Scalia does? What do we do every day? What do we do that affects those students and that they'll have to understand and explain to their parents and to others? And the way I put the question, and this is really all I'm going to say first, is how I think of the question. And I think from my institutional point of view, I want to tell people why maybe they'd give our institution support. So suppose I have the attention of a man or a woman who's going into a supermarket. Now, that's tough to get their attention. That woman says pretty busy. They may have 2 jobs. They may have a growing family. They have bills coming in every month. And they don't have too much time to listen to judges. So but suppose I get their attention on this question for just a few minutes, what would I say? The first thing they say is, what question? I'd say, I have to tell you what the question is. The question is this: the 9 of us are not elected, but we live in a democracy. And we do decide matters that will affect you. So why should 9 people who are not elected have that authority? And it's worse than that. Because if you look at why Hamilton gave us the power, and why the founders gave us the power to set aside a law of Congress contrary to the document, the Constitution. You read Federalist 78. Well, you know, she may be asleep by this time, but I have to get her attention and say, well, in Federalist 78, here's what he says. He says, first, look at the document. It's a great document, and it is. But if nobody's going to say when anybody else goes beyond its boundaries, let's hang it up in a museum. Let's put it in the National Gallery. Well, actually, he didn't say the National Gallery because it wasn't built at that time. But nonetheless, you understand the point. He says somebody should have that power. Who? The president? Well, the president has an awful lot of power. He could become a tyrant with that as well. Well, what about Congress? Congress is elected. He says, yes, that's the advantage, but that's also the problem, because Congress will have just passed a law because it's popular. This document gives the least popular person in the United States the same rights as the most popular. Are you sure Congress, having just passed that law, will turn around and say it's unconstitutional when it's very unpopular to do so? But here we have some judges. They're sort of bureaucrats. Nobody knows who they are. Fabulous. This has something to do with law, doesn't it? And they don't have the power of the purse, and they don't have the power of the sword. Wonderful. They don't have much power. And in addition, they're sort of judges, and it's not Congress and not the president. And he stops there. So I say, ma'am or sir, we are not elected. We are supposed to decide things that are unpopular on some occasion. And you know what? Don't tell anyone. We're human beings, and we may be wrong. Indeed, when I'm in dissent, I do think the majority is wrong. And so does Justice Scalia. And we can't both be right if we're opposite sides. So there we are, unelected, doing unpopular things, and quite possibly wrong. Why should you ever give us your support? And that's the question. And I get that question not just from people in supermarkets, not just from students or their teachers. I get that question from people all over the world. There are judges in our court that come to visit. There are Latin American judges or Asian judges. Or there was a woman who was Chief Justice of Ghana, and she posed that very question. She says, why do people do what you say? It's, you know, they have Henry IV over here. It's sort of Hotspur's question. Hotspur says, I can call spirits from the vasty deep. Or Owen Glendower says that. And Hotspur says, so can I, so can any man, but will they come when you do call them? And to answer that question, I have to give a little synopsis of history. But all I was doing in these 4 minutes was sketching out the question. And then I will turn to my colleague who can address that or anything else he would like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm happy to be back in front of the Judiciary Committee where I started this pilgrimage. I am going to get even more fundamental than my good friend and colleague. Like him, I speak to students, especially law students, but also college students and even high school students, quite frequently about the Constitution, because I feel that we're not teaching it very well. I speak to law students from the best law schools, people presumably especially interested in the law, and I ask them, how many of you have read the Federalist Papers? And well, a lot of hands will go out. No, not just number 48 and the big ones. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers cover to cover? Never more than about 5%. And that is very sad. I mean, especially if you're interested in the Constitution. Here's a document that says what the framers of it thought they were doing. It's such a profound exposition of political science that it is studied in political science courses in Europe. And yet we have raised a generation of Americans who are not familiar with it. So when I speak to these groups, the first point I make, and I think it's even a little more fundamental than the one that Stephen has just put forward, I ask them, what do you think is the reason that America is such a free country? What is it in our Constitution that makes us what we are? And I guarantee you that the response I will get, and you will get this from almost any American, including the woman that he was talking to at the supermarket, the answer would be freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in hope, those marvelous provisions of the Bill of Rights. But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press. Big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course, just words on paper, what our framers would have called a parchment guarantee. And the reason is that the real constitution of the Soviet Union, you think of the word constitution, it doesn't mean a bill, it means structure. Say a person has a sound constitution, has a sound structure. The real constitution of the Soviet Union, which is what our framers debated that whole summer in Philadelphia in 1787. They didn't talk about the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought, wasn't it? That Constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power in one person or in one party. And when that happens, the game is over. The Bill of Rights is just what our framers would call a parchment guarantee. So the real key to the distinctiveness of America is the structure of our government. One part of it, of course, is the independence of the judiciary. But there's a lot more. There are very few countries in the world, for example, that have a bicameral legislature. Oh, England has a House of Lords for the time being, but the House of Lords has no substantial power. They can just make the Commons pass a bill a second time. France has a Senate, it's honorific. Italy has a Senate, it's honorific. Very few countries have two separate bodies in the legislature equally powerful. That's a lot of trouble, as you gentlemen doubtless know, to get the same language through two different bodies elected in a different fashion. Very few countries in the world have a separately elected chief executive. Sometimes I go to Europe to talk about separation of powers. And when I get there, I find that all I'm talking about is independence of the judiciary, because the Europeans don't even try to divide the two political powers, the two political branches, the legislature and the chief executive. In all of the parliamentary countries, the chief executive is the creature of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between them and the prime minister, as there is sometimes between you and the president. When there's a disagreement, they just kick them out. They have a no confidence vote, a new election, and they get a prime minister who agrees with the legislature. And, you know, the Europeans look at this system and they say, well, it passes one house, it doesn't pass the other house. Sometimes the other house is in the control of a different party. It passes both, and then this president who has a veto power vetoes it, and they look at this and they say, it is gridlock. And I hear Americans saying this nowadays, and there's a lot of it going around. They talk about a dysfunctional government because there's disagreement, and the framers would have said, yes, that's exactly the way we set it up. We wanted this to be power, contradicting power, because the main ill that beset us, as Hamilton said in the Federalist, when he talked about a separate Senate. He said, yes, it seems inconvenient, but inasmuch as the main ill that besets us is an excess of legislation, it won't be so bad. This is 1787. He didn't know what an excess of legislation was. So unless Americans can appreciate that and learn to love the separation of powers, which means learning to love the gridlock, which the framers believed would be the main protection of minorities, the main protection. If a bill is about to pass that really comes down hard on some minority, they think it's terribly unfair. It doesn't take much to throw a monkey wrench into this complex system. So Americans should appreciate that, and they should learn to love the gridlock. It's there for a reason, so that the legislation that gets out will be good legislation. And thus conclude my opening remarks.
You may not get total unanimity on the issue of a gridlock, but I found listening to both of you to be fascinating, and I made a little note to myself. This is for everything that might go wrong this week, and all of this makes up for it, just having both of you here. So I do appreciate that.